Hey guys, tonight we're heading straight into the heart of a medieval royal court, where you've just been hired, or maybe, acquired, is the better word, as the king's newest jester. Imagine stepping through a pair of towering oak doors into the echoing great hall, your boots squeaking just slightly on the rush-covered floor, the air smelling faintly of roasted meat and beeswax. Every noble in the room turns to look at you, and it's not exactly the kind of attention that feels warm or welcoming. You're the curiosity of the week, like some rare bird caught in a net and brought here for everyone to gawk at. You've probably romanticized this moment, waltzing in, bells tinkling, making the king laugh until tears roll down his cheeks. Reality check, you probably won't survive this. Court life has a way of taking bright dreams and grinding them down into something flatter, paler, and much less fun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. I'm always curious to see just how far this sleepy little channel reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The great hall stretches out like a cathedral, its ceiling a dark puzzle of wooden beams, hung with faded banners that flap ever so slightly in the draft from unseen corridors. Torches flicker along the walls, each flame caught in a tiny dance, making shadows stretch and shrink across the stone. The throne at the far end rises above a platform draped in rich red cloth, velvet though worn at the edges from decades of royal posteriors. On it sits the king, leaning on one elbow, watching you with the interest of a cat that's just spotted something small and moving. The nobles cluster around, their robes like peacocks' tails, layered silks, fur trims, and the occasional jewel catching the firelight. Their conversations have paused, not in anticipation of your wit, but in the kind of cold curiosity people have when they're deciding if you're worth their attention. The air hums with low laughter and the metallic clink of goblets. Somewhere, a hound scratches itself against a table leg, its collar bells jangling in faint competition with yours. This is not the bustling, colorful marketplace where you might have been a street performer, blending in with jugglers, minstrels, and hawkers selling meat pies. Here, every move you make is weighed against centuries of tradition and the razor-sharp politics of the court. You are not here to entertain the people, you are here to entertain them. And them is a dangerous audience. A royal court is a living organism, all hierarchy and hidden rivalries. At its heart is the king, and orbiting him are dukes, duchesses, lords, ladies, advisors, and hangers-on. Everyone wants something. Some want to be noticed. Some want to avoid notice. And many will measure their worth by how the king reacts to you. If you make him laugh, you might earn his favor, and by extension theirs. If you bore him, you'll feel the chill long before winter arrives. The herald who escorted you in stands aside now, clearly amused by the tension he's delivered you into. He announces your name, or perhaps a stage name you've been given without consent, loud enough for the rafters to hear. A ripple of chuckles moves through the hall, but it's not quite laughter at a joke. More like the laughter of gamblers before the dice are thrown. Somewhere at the long feast table, a plump baroness raises an eyebrow at you, her mouth curling into a smile that might mean mischief. At her side, a narrow-faced young knight looks away quickly, as if pretending he wasn't studying your every move. You're already an object of speculation, maybe even a wager or two. Historians still argue whether jesters in this period were truly free in speech, or whether that freedom was a comforting myth used to explain why so many ended up vanishing from the record after displeasing their patrons. What's certain is that you are stepping into a tradition centuries old. Court jesters existed in ancient Egypt, Persia, China, long before this king's grandfather was a twinkle in anyone's eye. In Europe, they're often pictured as harmless fools, but the truth is more complicated. You're part performer, part confidant, part scapegoat, and part, well, political tool. The king gestures for you to approach. The walk from the door to the throne feels like 100 miles. The clatter of your bell seems too loud, your boots too heavy. The flagstones underfoot are cool, and you have the sudden irrational fear of tripping. You think of every street performance you've ever done, crowds gathered, coins tossed into your hat, and realize none of that prepared you for this. When you finally stand before the throne, the king leans forward, studying you like a painting he's not sure he likes yet. His eyes are sharp, his smile just wide enough to suggest amusement or calculation. He says something light, maybe a jest about your height or your hat. The nobles titter dutifully. You respond with a quick, careful, measured, testing the waters. It lands well enough for the king's smile to deepen. A servant appears at your elbow with a goblet of watered wine. It's both a welcome refreshment and a test. Will you drink with poise, or gulp like a farmhand? You sip slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes. The Baroness is still watching. The young knight still pretends not to. The herald smirks in the shadows. This is your stage now. The rush of the marketplace is gone. Here, every line you speak, every bow you make, every step you take is a note in the delicate, dangerous song of court life. And tonight is just the first verse. Your first performance isn't scheduled so much as summoned. One moment you're still getting your bearings, trying to remember which archway leads to the kitchens and which leads to the latrine, and the next, a steward is informing you that His Majesty requires amusement. That's the polite way of saying you'd better make him laugh before someone else makes him angry. You're escorted into the great hall again, but this time it's not empty. The long tables are half filled with courtiers lingering after a light midday meal. The air smells of roasted pigeon and sweet spiced wine. A few nobles still toy with their plates, picking at candied fruits or nuts, while others lean back, waiting to be entertained. The king sits casually, one hand draped over the armrest, his goblet resting in the other. His expression is neither bored nor amused, it's expectant. This is the part they never tell you in folktales about court jesters. Most of your acts are performed in rooms full of half-distracted people who aren't inclined to give you their full attention. You have to grab it, and then cling to it like a cat hanging from a tapestry. And you've got to do it fast, because the attention span of the bored and powerful is notoriously short. You start with a bow that's just exaggerated enough to be funny without seeming mocking. Then you launch into a little physical routine, some light juggling, a feigned stumble, a dramatic recovery. A few polite laughs ripple through the crowd, like distant thunder that might mean rain later. Encouraging, but not enough. The king tilts his head. A tale, he says simply. And that's it. No topic, no hint, just the demand. So, you launch into a short story, something you once told in a village square about a farmer who tried to train his goat to dance. You toss in a few winks toward the nobles, a sly jab about a lord, who was less clever than his livestock, and you hear the Baroness from earlier laugh a little too loudly. It's working, until it's not. The moment you describe the goat knocking over the farmer's wife, the young knight at the Baroness's table snorts into his wine. The Baroness glares. The knight's face flushes, and he suddenly finds the floor very interesting. You don't know it yet, but you've just stumbled into some miniature scandal. Maybe the knight is courting her daughter, maybe he once tripped over a goat himself. Court life is a minefield, and you've just heard a faint click underfoot. You pivot quickly, adding a flourish to the tale and turning the laugh toward yourself. You pretend you once lost a bet to a goose, bowing so low your bells jingle like a rain of tiny coins. Relief trickles through the room. The tension melts back into mild amusement. You've survived your first stumble without actually stumbling. Historians still argue whether jesters in the Middle Ages were expected to perform mostly verbal wit or physical comedy. Surviving records suggest it depended on the court and the ruler's personal taste. Some kings prized sharp-tongued fools who could weave clever wordplay. Others wanted tumblers, jugglers, and slapstick performers. You, unfortunately, seem to have landed in a court that expects both, and possibly at the same time. The king gives a small nod, which is as close as you're going to get to a standing ovation today. You take that as your cue to finish with a bit of harmless mockery of yourself, crossing your eyes, staggering backward, and pretending to faint. The nobles chuckle, the king smiles just enough for you to exhale, and the steward discreetly gestures that you may leave the floor. Walking out, you feel the heat of eyes on your back. Some are measuring you, deciding if you're worth befriending, or sabotaging. Others are dismissing you already, certain you'll never last the season. And yet there are a few glances, curious, even conspiratorial, that suggest you might have allies here if you play your cards right. Back in the corridor, you pass a tapestry depicting a hunting scene. The king in the woven image is spearing a stag while the hounds leap forward, teeth bared. You realize that the stag is you. Not literally, of course, but in the metaphorical sense. You're here for the chase, and everyone's going to take a turn testing your speed. A servant catches up to you, pressing a small pouch into your hand. Inside are a few silver pennies, your reward for the day. The coins are warm from her palm, and you can't help wondering if this is a gift from the king or from someone else entirely. In court, silver can be payment, encouragement, or bait. You tuck the pouch into your belt, already thinking about your next performance. The pressure doesn't fade after the first act, it only grows. Because now they know you can get a laugh, and they'll expect you to do it again. And again. And again. As you reach the small chamber they've assigned you for now, you catch a faint echo of laughter drifting down the hall. You can't tell if it's about you or not, but your gut tells you it probably is. They call it a wardrobe, but the thing waiting for you on the wooden stand in your quarters looks less like clothing and more like a dare. Two piles, one of brightly dyed fabric, the other of jingling metal and leather straps. Together, they form your new uniform, the garb of a royal fool. You've worn costumes before, but this one is different. For one thing, the colors could probably be seen from the next village over. They're not subtle. Scarlet, mustard yellow, peacock blue, each one chosen not because it flatters you, but because it shouts, "Look at me." And the bells, oh, the bells. They're sewn onto the hat, the cuffs, even the tips of your curled shoes. You pick up the hat first. It's the classic ass's ears style, two long, floppy points that dangle beside your face, each ending in a little brass bell. There's a third spike in the middle, pointing up like an afterthought. It's heavy, and it smells faintly of old sweat and lavender oil, as though someone tried to freshen it but gave up halfway. Pulling the tunic over your head is like forcing yourself into a tent made of tapestry scraps. It's thick and warm, too warm. The padding underneath makes it even hotter. You think about summer performances and feel a bead of sweat forming already. Somewhere in the back of your mind you remember reading, well, hearing, since your centuries before Google, that in some courts, jesters wore motley because the chaotic pattern was believed to keep away evil spirits. Maybe that's comforting, or maybe it's just another way of saying you're the designated distraction. Historians still argue whether all jesters actually wore motley or if that's a later stereotype painted by artists. There are records of fools in plain robes, fools in fancy doublets, even fools in nothing at all, though that last version probably didn't happen in drafty northern castles. Still, your king clearly subscribes to the paint the peacock school of thought. You step into the trousers, bright green, just in case the rest of the outfit wasn't already a visual assault, and then the shoes. Curled toes, leather so stiff it creaks, and bells that jingle with every movement. They are, without question, the least stealthy footwear imaginable. If you had to sneak anywhere in this palace, you'd be caught before you reached the door. The belt is the final piece, wide, leather, with a pouch for coins, a loop for a wooden baton, the bauble you'll wave around, and a dangling ornament shaped like a tiny fool's head, its painted grin just a bit unsettling. You've seen portraits where jesters carry these baubles as both props and symbols of their role. To be a mirror to the king, reflecting truths in a harmless guise. You're not sure you feel harmless. Once dressed, you catch sight of yourself in the small polished bronze disc they call a mirror. The motley turns you into something between a chessboard and a carnival banner. Your face looks both younger and older somehow, youth in the bright colors, age in the way your eyes have already learned to watch the door. Outside your chamber, a pair of servants pause as you step into the hall. One smothers a grin, the other doesn't bother. You jingle your way past them, pretending not to notice. The bells announce you to the world before you even round the corner. At the next junction, you pass a minstrel in muted blue robes. He gives you a slow, assessing look, half amusement, half pity, and strums a single note on his lute as you go by. It's not quite mockery, but it's close. You get the feeling he's filing you away under competition. The thing about your outfit is that it's both your armor and your target. People will remember you. They'll call you by name, or by whatever nickname they give you, because you are impossible to miss. And that means you'll be noticed in places where being invisible might be safer. By the time you reach the Great Hall again, you've learned two things about the wardrobe. First, it's uncomfortable enough to make you long for rags. And second, it's a constant reminder of your role. Every swish of fabric, every faint jingle, tells you you're here to amuse, not to blend in. The king glances up from a cluster of advisors, his gaze sweeping over your new attire. For a moment there's silence, then a short, sharp laugh, one that actually sounds genuine. You've passed one test at least, you look the part. Whether you can survive in it is another matter entirely. Your new quarters turn out to be less of a room and more of a forgotten alcove tucked behind the throne platform. Calling it modest would be generous. This is a space you'd hesitate to rent to a goat. A narrow wooden door opens onto a windowless nook, barely wide enough for the straw mattress pushed up against one wall. The mattress smells faintly of damp wool and old smoke, like it's absorbed every odor of the hall over the last decade. The air is cool here, but not in a refreshing way. It's the damp chill of stone that never quite dries. A single candle stub on a crude table provides your only light. Its flame wavers in the draft seeping under the ill-fitting door. You can hear every sound from the great hall through the thin wall. Clinking goblets, the shuffle of boots, the king's voice rising and falling in conversation. If someone were to sneeze out there, you'd know. Historians still argue whether jesters were kept close to the throne for the monarch's convenience, or to keep them under constant watch. The truth is likely a bit of both. You're positioned perfectly to be summoned at a moment's notice, though that also means you'll hear every council meeting, every royal quarrel, whether you want to or not. On the far wall, there's a shelf no wider than your palm, holding exactly 2 items, a wooden cup with a crack down one side, and a small cloth bag of what you suspect is dried lavender. The lavender is supposed to keep the place smelling pleasant, but it's losing the battle against centuries of dust. The floorboards creak underfoot, an oddly comforting sound, until you realize they're not floorboards at all but a thin layer of wood over cold stone. The faint crunch you hear when you walk barefoot is likely dirt from the great hall filtering down through the cracks. On damp days, the smell of spilled wine from the feasts above drifts into your space, mingling with the ever-present dust. Your sleeping arrangement consists of that straw mattress, a wool blanket that's almost as scratchy as it is warm, and a pillow that feels like it's been stuffed with old rags. You lie down experimentally, and the bells on your hat jingle just enough to make you consider sleeping without it. You'll have to keep your costume nearby at all times. If the king calls, you won't have the luxury of dressing slowly. There's no window, which means no natural light, but the sound of the court becomes your clock. You learn to tell morning from afternoon by the pattern of noise, the early clatter of servants, the mid-morning hum of advisors, the slow build of laughter and music toward evening. Nights are a mix of drunken singing and, occasionally, the kind of heavy silence that means something important, or unpleasant, has happened. Once in a while, a servant slips in to leave food, bread, cheese, maybe a handful of berries if you're lucky. They never linger, and they never make eye contact for long. To them, you're a part of the furniture, an ornament of the court. Not quite a noble, not quite a servant, but always on display. You find one quirk of your quarters that's unexpectedly useful. There's a small gap in the wall, just above the head of your bed, where the stones don't quite meet. If you press your ear to it, you can hear voices from the royal platform, sometimes the king's, sometimes his advisors. It's not exactly espionage, but it's enlightening. You quickly realize this might be both a blessing and a curse. You'll hear things you probably shouldn't. You'll also know when someone mentions your name. In a way, the space suits your new role perfectly, close enough to the king to be dragged out for amusement at a moment's notice, yet isolated enough to remind you of your place. The bells on your costume seem louder in here, echoing off the walls when you move. You sit on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled sounds beyond the wall. Somewhere out there, the king is laughing at something, someone's joke, a bit of gossip, maybe a drunken slip from a baron. For tonight, it's not your job to make him laugh. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, you might be woken before dawn, told to perform before you've even rubbed the sleep from your eyes. The thought isn't exactly comforting, but in this strange new life, comfort might be the one thing you can't expect. Evening in the great hall is a spectacle you can smell before you see. The aroma of roasted boar and spiced wine hangs heavy in the air, mingled with the faint tang of candle smoke and wet wool from cloaks hung up near the door. The long trestle tables groan under platters of food, piled high with joints of meat, steaming bowls of pottage, loaves of fresh bread still warm from the oven. Your role in this feast is not to eat. Not yet, anyway. You're here to perform. And that means you have to thread yourself into the flow of the evening without becoming background noise. Nobles chatter, cups clink, dogs skitter under the benches, and you, bells jingling, slip between the tables like an especially colorful ghost. The king sits at the high table, flanked by his queen and his favorite advisors. The queen's jewels sparkle like drops of sunlight on water, but her eyes barely flick toward you. The king, however, watches with that sharp amusement you've started to recognize, half challenge, half invitation. Your first task tonight: warm the room. It's easier said than done. Drunken barons will shout for you to do something funny, while they gnaw on chicken legs. Others ignore you completely, except to toss the occasional comment your way. "Is that hat heavy, fool?" Followed by their own laughter. You learn quickly that you can't please everyone at once. You start with a few quick quips, weaving between the tables. You mock the hound that just stole a chunk of venison from under a knight's elbow, then you bow dramatically to a platter of cheese as if it were a foreign dignitary. Laughter bubbles here and there, not the roaring kind, but enough to turn a few heads in your direction. The danger at these feasts isn't boredom, it's overstepping. Historians still argue whether jesters were encouraged to poke fun at guests as much as their ruler. Some records suggest they were, as long as the joke was clever and not cruel. Others hint that a single misjudged jest could sour a noble against you for years. Tonight you decide to err on the side of sly rather than sharp. Halfway through the feast, a servant clears a small space in front of the high table. This is your stage now. You juggle 3 apples, then 4, adding a tin cup into the mix for surprise. You pretend to drop it, catching it at the last second, and the crowd actually gasps before laughing. It's not Shakespeare, but it works. Then comes the moment you've been dreading, physical comedy while dodging the detritus of the feast. As you spin into a mock dance, a bone skitters across the floor toward you. You sidestep it neatly, only to have a piece of bread bounce off your shoulder. The culprit is a red-faced baron at the far table, grinning like a schoolboy who's just gotten away with something. You turn the moment to your advantage, scooping up the bread and bowing to him as though he's just bestowed a great honor. The baron laughs so hard he nearly spills his wine. From the corner of your eye, you see the king smile, not just politely, but with genuine amusement. That's your cue to keep going. You close with a parody of a noble's hunting trip, complete with exaggerated bow shots and dramatic falls into imaginary mud. By the end, the high table is chuckling, the Baroness is dabbing at her eyes, and even the Queen looks faintly entertained. You retreat from the cleared space with a bow, bells chiming. The servants swoop in to refill goblets, the music from the minstrels swells again, and you're left to circulate in the crowd. This is the part you enjoy most, not the big performance, but the small interactions. A wink to a kitchen boy as he passes, a whispered aside to a lady-in-waiting that makes her stifle a laugh. These moments make you feel less like a prop and more like a thread in the tapestry of the court. But the feast is long, and by the time the platters are down to scraps, your legs ache from dancing and your cheeks from smiling. You finally manage to slip toward the edge of the hall, leaning against a pillar to catch your breath. The bells on your hat jingle faintly as you tilt your head back, watching the smoke from the candles curl upward into the dark rafters. Somewhere deep in the shadows above, an owl hoots from the open window's slit. You wonder if it's watching you the way the nobles do, curious, alert, and ready to swoop if you slip. It happens sooner than you expect, the moment when your tongue runs a fraction too far ahead of your brain. The great hall is busy again, though this time it's not a full feast. The king is entertaining a smaller group, half a dozen nobles seated at the high table, their goblets shining in the candlelight. The mood is lighter than usual, the wine flowing faster, and you, emboldened by a few successful quips earlier in the evening, let your wit loosen just a little too much. It starts innocently enough. You're telling a story about a market day brawl over a wheel of cheese, acting out the characters, an old woman with a cane, a merchant who talks too fast, a bumbling guard. The nobles laugh in the right places, and you feel that warm hum of control you get when the room is yours. Then you glance toward a tall, hawk-nosed duke sitting near the queen. He's wearing an elaborate hat with a feather that could double as a banner pole, and you can't resist. "Of course," you say, slipping into the role of the vain merchant. "I'd have won the fight too, if only I had a hat like that, to frighten the birds away." There's a beat of silence. Not much, half a heartbeat, but enough to make your stomach dip. The duke blinks once slowly. The queen's mouth freezes halfway to a sip of wine. The king's gaze sharpens, not angry, not amused, just watching. A few courtiers chuckle, then quickly hide it behind their hands. The duke leans back, one hand resting on the table as if to signal that he's not offended, yet. You scramble to soften the jab. "A fine hat, truly," you say, sweeping into an exaggerated bow. "Fit for a man who could stare down a goose at 20 paces and win." That draws a ripple of genuine laughter. Goose imagery always seems to land well, and the moment passes. The duke even smirks, though it's the kind of smirk you file away as dangerous. Historians still argue whether jesters had an unspoken list of "do not mock" subjects, or if those boundaries shifted daily with the tempers of their patrons. In reality, you know every joke is a gamble. Even a mild jest can sour if it strikes a hidden nerve. You keep your routine going, but now you're on edge. Every face you look at could be hiding a bruise you don't know about, a feud, a scandal, a personal embarrassment, and if you step on it, you'll feel the snap underfoot. Later, as you're leaving the hall, the steward catches up to you. He doesn't scold you outright, he simply says, "Best not to let your tongue wander too close to the high table's pride." Then he walks away. You're left standing there, wondering if that was a warning, an order, or both. In the quieter corridor beyond, you replay the scene in your head. You think about how the laughter dipped, how quickly the air shifted. You realize that being a jester isn't about making everyone laugh, it's about knowing exactly who you can afford to make laugh at someone else's expense. And that list, you suspect, is shorter than the one for people who can ruin you. You reach your cramped quarters behind the throne and sit on the edge of your straw bed, still in full motley. The bells on your cuffs give a soft, uneven jingle as you rub your temples. Somewhere in the hall beyond, the murmur of conversation continues. You can't hear the words, but you imagine the Duke's name passing from one mouth to another, your own trailing along behind it like an unwelcome shadow. The thought crosses your mind that the next time you see that hat with the giant feather, you should probably bow to it before you bow to its owner. The strangest thing about your job is the razor you're handed with the word privilege engraved on the blade. You are, nominally, permitted to poke fun at the one person nobody else may touch, the king. It's a license that glitters like gold and cuts like it too. Tonight the court's a little restless, the air sweet with wine and tallow, and the king's in that curious mood where he wants not simply laughter but edge. You can feel it in the way he taps his goblet, knuckle against silver, as if sounding out a drumbeat for your courage. You begin with your safe warm-ups, a stumble, a wink toward the hounds snoring under the trestle, a play-acted whisper about the kitchen's pottage being so thick the spoon stands at attention longer than any guard. Laughter comes, polite, but the king's eyes stay bright and expectant, like lanterns peering into fog. He wants the other thing, the thing only you can give. He wants you to lift a mirror to his own face and make it smile back. You take a breath, the bells on your hat whispering don't do it, and do it at exactly the same time, and step into the narrowest of tightropes. Your Majesty, you say lightly. Word in the corridors is that your patience is so wide the hounds get lost in it, but so short that the Baron's chicken never reaches the spit. There's a tremor of attention through the hall, like cloth being pulled taut. Then the king's mouth curls. A laugh, small, genuine, escapes him. The hall exhales with him, and your knees remember how to be knees. This, you learn, is the delicate art of the dangerous privilege. In theory, the jester speaks truth in a velvet coat, pricks pomposity with a puffball. In practice, you're guessing the weather with your bare skin. Some rulers enjoy sharpness. Henry VIII kept Will Somers, and contemporaries wrote that Somers could ease the king's black moods with a joke, even nudge him off a bad decision with a well-timed quip. That's your mainstream fact for the evening. Kings have kept fools close to soft and hard edges, a pattern repeated from castles to chateaus. But every court is its own climate, and umbrellas are not universal. The king leans his cheek against his fist, smiling for you alone now. Go on, he says, a challenge in 2 words. So you go on carefully. You mimic his walk for 1 step, only one, exaggerate the way he squints at accounts, then reassure him with a flourish of your bauble, the painted little fool's head bobbing like an accomplice. The court laughs. The queen glances at the king and, finding the corners of his mouth still up, allows herself a sliver of amusement. The hawk-nosed duke, remember him, studies you as if weighing the cost of rope. A quirky tidbit slips in. You tap the bauble's wooden skull and confide to the room that it's stuffed with wisdom, which is why it makes a hollow sound. Just like the steward's wine casks when guests linger too long. Even the steward chuckles at that, relieved not to be the target this time. You spin the bauble once more and kiss its cheek for luck. It tastes of old varnish and a decision you may regret. Historians still argue whether the fool's license was real law or a social fiction, renewed nightly by laughter and revoked by a single wrong syllable. Some chronicles describe fools given extraordinary leeway. Others record brisk punishments when the line vanished beneath their feet. You've started to think it works like a candle. As long as you're keeping the flame bright, the wax holds. Let it gutter, and everything collapses in warm, shapeless ruin. You press on with one more gleam of risk. Sire, you say, if your justice is a sword, then your mercy is the scabbard, and tonight I beg you keep the blade sheathed, for my jokes are as soft as the Baron's middle. Your palm hovers over your own belly with an apologetic pat. The Baron, red-faced and sporting fresh grease on his mustache, bursts into laughter and thumps the table so hard a pear rolls into a goblet. The king laughs again, longer this time, and you feel the tightrope widen by an inch. Then you feel it narrow again. He raises a finger. "Do you ever tire of jesting, fool?" he asks, in that deceptively soft tone rulers use when they're handling glass. The hall quiets. It is a question and a test, a search for the seam in your motley where truth might peek through. You answer as gently as you can. "Only when the night tires of the moon, your majesty. But if ever I do, I pray you'll lend me your crown, for it looks light enough to carry." A third laugh, smaller, more personal, flickers across his face. Your heart, which had taken up residence in your throat, trudges back to its original address. You add a small flourish of physical comedy to sand down the sharpness, a theatrical bow that goes too low, your bells chiming in complaint, a wobble you catch at the last instant like a miracle granted to slippers. Someone claps, someone else sighs in relief. The moment passes without drawing blood. Afterward, when the hall has returned to the gentle thunder of knives and gossip, the king beckons you closer. Not for a reprimand, he slips something into your palm, a signet stamp token, the kind that makes gatekeepers blink and step aside. "So you may walk where others may not," he says, half smile, as if he's giving you a lantern and a maze in the same motion. You bow with care. The token is warm and heavy, and also heavier in a way weight can't measure. Back in your little alcove behind the throne, you place the token beside the cracked wooden cup and the tired lavender. The three objects look like a riddle with no answer: drink, scent, seal. Your bed creaks as you sit, costume creasing in bright zigzags across your knees. Your bells mumble their metallic lullaby. Through the stone gap above your pillow, voices drift, advisors trading whispers, the steward counting something that refuses to be counted, the king's laughter returning in short, surprised bursts, echoes of what you made possible. You think of the other fools whose names occasionally fall like breadcrumbs through the talk. Triblet at the French court, so daring he was once permitted to choose his own punishment. He picked death by old age, which is the finest punchline you've ever heard. Will Summers again, aging gracefully alongside his fearsome tutor master, nameless. Naturals, too, whose innocence was exploited as entertainment and shelter both. You wonder, quiet as breath, which kind of fool you are. A trained one, certainly, an artificial, in the old terms, who learned pratfalls before prayers. But sometimes, when the hall blurs under candle smoke and your jokes run on rails, you suspect the line between all kinds of foolishness is as wavy as the embroidery on your cuffs. A last small joke for yourself, you lift the hat with its 3 points, the 2 floppy ears and the stubborn middle, and whisper, "Gentlemen, the evening's triumph belongs to you." The hat does not reply, which is a mercy. If it ever did, you'd be out of work. As you lie back, you make a quiet pact with your ribs to keep your heart inside them the next time the king invites you to play on the cliff's edge. That edge, after all, is where the view is clearest and the wind is coldest, and where a misstep, even as small as the pause before a laugh, is the difference between favor and forgetting. It's late enough that most of the nobles have either drifted to their chambers or collapsed in a haze of wine somewhere between the high table and the door, when a knock comes at your alcove door. You're still half in costume, sprawled on your straw mattress, one boot off and one boot on. The knock is followed by a whisper. "The king requires you." Privately. There's no hesitation. You're on your feet in a moment, jamming your second boot on, bells rattling. A summons to the royal chambers could mean anything: an impromptu jest, a confidential message, or, if the mood has soured, an audience you'd rather avoid. But you don't get to choose. A steward leads you through narrow corridors lit only by wall sconces, the light catching the cold gleam of tapestries embroidered with scenes of past kings, grim, unsmiling men whose eyes seem to follow you. You've never walked this route before. It winds away from the public halls into a quieter, more guarded part of the castle. The air here is cooler, the stone walls thick with silence. The steward stops outside a carved oak door, mutters to a guard, and steps aside. The guard pushes the door open. You enter, and the hush is immediate. The king's private chamber is not the lavish, gilded dream you might expect. Yes, there's a canopy bed with rich hangings, and yes, the rugs are finer than anything you've ever stepped on barefoot. But the space feels lived in. There's a half-drained goblet on a side table, a pair of boots kicked under a chair, and the faint smell of beeswax polish and damp wool. The king is seated by the fire, one leg stretched out, a robe over his tunic. He looks up and smiles, not the polite, measured smile for court, but something smaller, almost weary. "Fool," he says, "I can't sleep. Amuse me." And so you do. You start small, shadow play against the firelight, shaping your hands into a dog that chases an imaginary hare across the wall. You juggle 3 apples from a bowl on the table, nearly, accidentally, dropping one into the king's lap. You tell him a ridiculous story about a goose who wanted to be a knight, complete with honking battle cries. He chuckles, sipping his wine. You notice the way his shoulders ease with each laugh. This isn't about dazzling the court or proving your wit, it's about pulling someone, briefly, out of their own head. You've done this for farmers, children, merchants, and now for the man who could end your career, or your life, with a single nod. Historians still argue whether these private summonses were moments of genuine friendship or simply another kind of service expected from the fool. Some say jesters were trusted confidants, others claim they were just furniture that talked. Tonight, it feels like both. You're here because you're useful, but you're also being let into a quieter, more human corner of the king's life. Halfway through your routine, he interrupts. "Do you think they lie to me?" His tone is mild, but his eyes are sharp. You pause, bauble in hand. This is not a question you can answer carelessly. You take a breath, then say, "Not when you're looking at them, sire. But perhaps when your eyes are elsewhere." He smiles faintly, as if you've confirmed something he already suspected. "That's why I keep you, fool," he says. "The others feared to say it." The conversation drifts after that. He asks about the kitchens, whether the cooks gossip more than the guards, and whether the minstrel is really as talented as he claims. You answer honestly, adding just enough humor to keep the tone light. Every so often, you catch a glint in the king's eye that says he's enjoying this more than the grandest feast. Eventually, he waves you away. "Go, fool! Sleep! But keep your ears open." The phrase lodges in your mind. You bow, retreating from the chamber. The steward is waiting in the corridor to escort you back, but the walk feels shorter this time, your head buzzing with the new weight of what just happened. Back in your alcove, you sit on the bed in the dim candlelight. You've just been reminded of something important. In this court, you are more than an entertainer. You are a distraction, a tool, and sometimes, a listener in places others can't go. And tonight you've also learned something else. Private summons are not just a test of wit, but a test of trust. And trust, here, is a currency more valuable than silver. It begins subtly enough, just a few glances exchanged between nobles while you're performing, a slip of folded parchment left on the edge of the dais where you'll be sure to see it. At first, you think it's a love note from some flirtatious lady-in-waiting. But when you unfold it in the privacy of your cramped quarters, you find a request written in neat, perfumed script. Tell His Majesty that Lord Heron has sent his regards, and remind him about the hunting trip. It's signed with nothing but an elaborate flourish. No explanation, no coin, just the message. The next evening, while you're skipping between tables at a small feast, Lord Heron himself beckons you over. He leans in, his breath heavy with spiced wine, and presses a single silver penny into your palm. "Say it exactly as written," he whispers. His smile is pleasant enough, but there's something in his eyes that makes it clear this isn't a suggestion. You've seen this before, in the markets and taverns, people trying to use someone else to pass along words they'd rather not say directly. The difference is that here, the stakes are considerably higher. The wrong message to the wrong ears could be seen as harmless gossip, or treason. That night, when the king calls you over for a jest, you slip in the line about Lord Heron's regards, as if it's part of a silly hunting story. The king laughs, at least, you think he's laughing at the story, and nods once, as though filing the remark away. Historians still argue whether jesters were aware of their own role as political messengers, or if they simply repeated what they were told, unwitting pawns in a larger game. You don't have the luxury of ignorance. You can feel the tug of invisible strings every time someone asks you to pass along a word. Within a week, you've carried messages for 3 different nobles. Some are harmless, reminders about debts, questions about which musicians the king prefers. Others are sharper, hints about alliances, comments about untrustworthy guests. You deliver them all in jest, each wrapped in a punchline so that, if questioned, you can claim it was nothing but a joke. The strangest request comes from the Queen's own lady-in-waiting. She catches you in the corridor, pressing a folded scrap into your hand. "Tell the king this, when no one else can hear," she says. You open it later to find a single line: "The falcon has flown." You don't know if it's code or poetry, or if it refers to an actual bird. You deliver it anyway, late that evening when the king is alone by the fire. He pauses, says nothing, then waves you away. The next morning you notice that one of the king's more talkative advisors is conspicuously absent from breakfast. It's in these moments you realize you're not just the entertainment, you're a moving piece in the board game that is court politics. A rook disguised in motley, sliding between pawns and kings alike. There's a quirky little court custom you stumble into. Some nobles slip coins into your pouch not as payment for your performances, but as a signal they've given you a task. If the coin is silver, the matter is urgent. If it's copper, it can wait. Once, a particularly bold countess hands you a gold coin along with a message, and you find the coin gone from your pouch before you've even reached your quarters. Someone else is watching the watchers. This double life comes with tension you can't share. You can't tell the minstrels, who would happily trade the story for favor. You can't tell the servants, who might repeat it without understanding the danger. And you certainly can't tell the king, because sometimes you're not entirely sure if the message is meant for him at all, or if you're just a decoy while something else happens in the background. One night, as you pass through the shadows behind the throne, you catch the hawk-nosed duke speaking quietly to the steward. The words are too low to catch, but when he notices you, he smiles in that way that's both a warning and a promise. You realize, with a cold knot in your stomach, that he knows exactly how many messages you've carried lately. And he's probably wondering what you might carry for him. You start to suspect that your best routine isn't the one with juggling or pratfalls. It's the one where you keep your mouth shut and your ears open. The token the king gave you, warm, heavy, stamped with his signet, opens doors the way a punchline opens a room, quietly, and then all at once. You can drift behind screens, along gallery edges, through buttery corridors that smell of yeast and tallow, and people scarcely register you as a person. You're scenery that jingles. And scenery, you've learned, hears everything. The first real lesson comes in the chapel gallery. You're there because the chaplain has a fondness for small audiences and big scoldings, and you've been sent to brighten the vestry's mood after someone misplaced the reliquary key. While you wait, you lean on the carved rail above the nave and listen to 2 knights mutter about a border skirmish as if they were swapping pie recipes. You don't catch all of it, something about levies and a reeve who counts men poorly, but you catch enough to know that the king's sleepy northern problem is fully awake. Later, at supper, you fold that knowledge into a joke about the steward's chickens migrating north for better lodging. The king glances up, only for a second, but his eyes sharpen. You've placed a breadcrumb where he can find it without anyone else seeing the loaf. Soon it becomes routine. You hover at the edge of a council where the queen pretends to sew while measuring every word, and you learn which lord's smile is a lock that never clicks. You pass through the scullery, and a potboy blurts that a courier rode in at dawn with muddy boots and a white face. You file that away and make a gentle quip later. Some letters gallop faster than their horses, to see who winces. You stand near the musicians and learn that the soprano from last year's visit is being courted as avidly as any duchess, and that one flautist keeps packing to leave and unpacking when the pay chest opens again. It's all noise and it's all signal. Your job is to hear which is which. Mainstream fact to keep your compass straight. It's not unheard of for a jester to appear in household accounts, right there with pages and yeomen. Henry VIII's Will Somers shows up in the ledgers, paid as a member of the royal household. That tells you fools weren't just party favors. They were staff, present in the gears that grind power into shape. Staff go everywhere. Staff see everything. The oddest piece of intelligence comes via a creature smaller than your bauble's painted head, a monkey. A visiting envoy arrives with a little macaque on a chain, dressed in a miniature jerkin. The court squeals, half delight, half alarm, while you share a glance with a groom who's decidedly unimpressed. The envoy lets the monkey scamper along the tapestries behind the high table, and in the commotion a folded bit of vellum slips from the envoy's sleeve into the hands of a certain lady-in-waiting. Most people watch the monkey. You watch the paper. Quirky tidbit, yes, monkeys at court, silly and fashionable, but they're also distractions with opposable thumbs. Later, you make a lazy joke about imported jesters with better climbing, and note exactly who doesn't laugh. Historians still argue whether fools actively served as informants for spymasters or whether we've embroidered those stories after the fact. You've heard tavern tales that Richard Tarleton, Elizabeth's favorite clown, if your timeline were to fast forward, was tapped for eavesdropping in London alehouses. Whether that's true or an actor's legend, the shape of the idea fits. The person everyone overlooks can carry more truth than the person everyone fears. You are learning to be overlooked professionally. The hawk-nosed duke, who has a habit of appearing where carpet meets shadow, begins to treat you the way falconers treat their birds, a small treat, a soft whistle, a glove extended only when he's sure of your hunger. He never says plainly what he wants. He says things like, "If a joke were told that happened to set a fox trotting from the henhouse, would the teller be blamed, or the fox?" You answer with the safest nonsense you can muster. "Depends on whether the hens applaud." He smiles, and your spine writes a letter that reads, "This man is running out of patience." You press your ear to the stone gap above your bed each night, and catch fragments. "Coiners," someone says. "A map, but wrong. The heron hunting trip is a feint." You realize then that the folded notes, and whispered, "regards," from Section 9 weren't the game, they were the warm-up. The game is whether you can put these shards together in such a way that the king gains a step and no one can mark where he found the staircase. So you craft a new act, the accidental fable. In the afternoon, when the hall is cool and half empty, you perform a small story about a miller who thinks he owns the river because he owns the mill, and a fox who learns the miller's schedule by listening through the boards. The king watches from the dais, one leg thrown over the other. When you get to the part where the miller falls in because the fox chewed through the rope on the sluice, the king raises his goblet by an inch. Later, the steward happens to ask you to repeat that fable in a room with a tapestry you've never seen lowered before. You notice 3 pairs of boots under the arras and speak more slowly than the bells think necessary. To keep your own head from puffing up like overproved dough, you hold to small disciplines. You never bring the first rumor you hear to the king. You never bring the last either, they're often baited hooks. You cross-check gossip in kitchens against gossip in armories, because cooks and guards lie differently and for different reasons. You use the motif of your act as camouflage. If 3 people tell you the Eastern Gates watch is doubled, then tonight you make your jokes about gates and keys and the kind of man who hires 2 watchdogs when he can't trust one. You watch the faces that stiffen. Every countenance is a ledger. There are missteps. One evening you hint that the scribe's ink supply is suspiciously plentiful for a pen that writes so little, thinking to prod a lazy clerk. The clerk turns out to be faithful and overworked. The plentiful ink is for copying a treaty under secrecy. The king's gaze lands on you, cool as iron, and you let the arrow die quickly in a tumble that leaves you with a bruised hip and a sense of proportions restored. Later you bring him something better, that the queen's falconer has been asked to ride messages at dusk, when the courtyard looks only at the sky. You develop a test for yourself, the ladle rule. If a rumor could be stirred into pottage and served to any table without the household taking notice, then it is too thin. If a rumor would thicken the pot so much the spoon stands up, then it may be worth the king's bread. It's a ridiculous metric, but it keeps you from running after every glittering tale like a magpie in a crown shop. One afternoon, the token on your belt admits you to a solar where 3 maps lie spread like flattened dragons. You're there ostensibly to amuse a cluster of bored pages while their tutor gulps wine in the corridor. A corner of one map is smudged with ash where someone's finger rested too long near a candle. Borders are redrawn in chalk that hasn't been fixed with gum arabic yet. A living map, not a record. You offer the boys a rhyme about rivers and roads. While they chant, you see that the route Lord Heron bragged about is impossible unless a bridge is rebuilt. That evening, in a short turn before the king, you twine your fingers into a bridge shape and accidentally break it, letting the top collapse. He does not laugh. He does nod. Now and then the work brushes the absurd so hard it squeaks. A maid slips you a nut cake because you once told a joke about preferring almonds to Ammonite ambassadors. The ambassador hears of it and gifts you candied ginger by way of truce in a war he wasn't even fighting. You learn to accept all sweets while trusting none. You give most of them to the potba who told you about the Dawn Courier, because loyalties, like jokes, need feeding. The line you started walking back when you mimicked the king's squint, remember section 7, has only grown narrower. But there's a paradoxical comfort here. You're doing the one thing that makes the motley feel earned, turning noise into guidance. You're not plotting, you're translating. And if you do it right, it looks like luck. As you curl into your straw at night, the bells on your hat whisper against the blanket. They sound less like mockery now and more like wind chimes somewhere near a harbor you can't see. You think of Tribulate with his clever punishment request, of nameless fools inked into ledgers beside candles and salt, of monkeys in jerkins and notes that ride out of rooms under cover of applause. You think of the king's token, warm against your hip, and the way his eyes track a joke for meaning the way a kestrel tracks a vole for movement. You breathe, slow and even, and decide that tomorrow's act will be about a fox who learns to swim. No reason. And every reason. It's easy to forget, in the swirl of politics and performance, that your job is also brutally physical. There's no such thing as a day off. When you are the jester, even if the king is away on a hunt, the household will find ways to wring a pratfall or a backflip out of you. Your body, in short, is a piece of court property, expected to bend, leap, tumble, and contort on command. This morning, it begins with a summons to the courtyard. The air is damp and cold, the kind that gets into your joints, but the king is in a boisterous mood. He's showing off a new destrier to a visiting earl, and he decides that you will be the warm-up act before the horses. Performance. You're handed 2 wooden clubs, heavy, poorly balanced, and told to juggle them while walking backward. On cobblestones. Surrounded by puddles. You do it because you must, all the while keeping a running patter about how the horse looks far better groomed than the groom. The earl laughs, the king grins, and you somehow avoid cracking your skull on the stones. But it doesn't stop there. Someone shouts for a handspring, and you oblige, once, twice, 3 times, until you land a little off and jar your wrist. It throbs immediately, though you mask it with a bow and a flourish. Historians still argue whether jesters were truly multi-skilled athletes, or if the tumbling was mostly the work of specialized acrobats. Surviving records suggest many fools were expected to be physical performers, especially in smaller courts where one person had to do everything. You're beginning to believe that the only qualification for this job is a high pain tolerance. Later in the day, there's a small gathering in the solar. The Queen's Lady's request. The leapfrog game. Which sounds innocent until you realize they mean a sequence of vaults over 3 pages, a table, and a particularly sharp-edged bench. You do it anyway, bells jingling like a mad chorus, earning gasps and applause, and a bruise blossoming along your thigh. By evening, your body feels like it's been pounded with a mallet. You sit in your alcove, boots off, flexing your sore wrists and rolling your ankles to keep them from stiffening. Your motley tunic clings damp with sweat, not from heat, but from sheer exertion. That's when you remember the oddest tip you've ever received. A cook once told you to drink cabbage water for sore muscles. Quirky, yes, but after the day you've had, you're tempted. You slip into the kitchen, snag a cup of the warm, murky liquid, and grimace as you drink. Maybe it works. Maybe it's just that the kitchen staff likes having an excuse to watch the fool drink something disgusting. The physical toll is cumulative. Every tumble jars your spine, every exaggerated bow pulls at the muscles in your back. Even your face gets tired from smiling and exaggerating expressions. There's no medieval physiotherapy waiting at the end of the night. Only the straw bed, the scratchy blanket, and the faint hope that tomorrow will be lighter. And yet, when the king calls again, midnight this time, you haul yourself up, hat on, bells ready. Because pain is just another part of the costume. If there's one thing you've learned, it's that you're not the only source of amusement in the castle. The court is a crowded stage, and you share it, often uneasily, with troubadours, minstrels, mummers, and the occasional traveling troupe passing through. On your best days, these others are companions in the strange craft of keeping the powerful entertained. On your worst days, they're rivals with sharper smiles than any dagger. The tension starts the moment a troupe of mummers arrives from a neighboring duchy. They're loud, colorful, and frighteningly coordinated, 5 men, 3 women, all dressed in rich fabrics that make your motley look like a worn market tent. They're welcomed like long-lost family, offered fine wine and a space in the hall without a second thought. The king greets them warmly and says, "Our fool will be glad to share the stage." Share. A generous word that in practice means compete for the same laughs. You spend the first evening watching their act from the side of the dais. Their leader, a man with a voice like a bell, tells a story in verse while the others act it out in exaggerated pantomime. The audience roars at a slapstick tumble that you recognize as one of your own signature moves. Only they'd polished it, sharpened it, and made it bigger. The next night you're back on stage. The mummers watch you from the benches, arms folded. You decide not to outdo their acrobatics but to lean into what they don't have, quick improvisation. You pick on details in the room, a lord's new boots, the minstrel's sour expression, the spilled wine under the high table, and weave them into a story so fresh the ink would smear if it were written down. The laughter you get is different, sharper, closer, more personal. Historians still argue whether jesters and minstrels truly resented one another or if the rivalry was more for show. In theory, minstrels provided music and tales while fools handled comedy and commentary. In practice, the lines blurred constantly. A minstrel with a biting song could be as cutting as a jester with a clever tongue, and a jester who could sing might steal a minstrel's thunder. The rivalry with troubadours is trickier still. They're romantic creatures by reputation, wandering poets with honeyed voices, but some are as political as any courtier. One such troubadour, a handsome man with hair like spun gold, sidles up to you one afternoon. "If you ever wish to trade a laugh for a lyric," he says, "I'm always looking for new material." It sounds friendly, but you know better. Sharing material is like sharing armor. It leaves you both vulnerable in exactly the same place. Then there's the minstrel, the one in muted blue robes you passed weeks ago when you first donned your motley. He's been watching you ever since, his lute always nearby. One evening, after you finish a set that gets more laughs than the mummers managed, he starts a song. The lyrics are playful enough, about a fool who thought himself the king's favorite, but the chorus is barbed. The bells will ring, the bells will fade, when brighter toys are brought and played. It earns a polite chuckle from the courtiers, but you hear the knife in it. It's a warning, maybe even a prophecy. Quirky tidbit: some courts kept more than one jester at a time, sometimes a natural fool, alongside a trained performer like you. In those cases, the competition wasn't about talent but about favor. There are stories of jesters subtly undermining each other in performance, turning routines into contests, even planting small mishaps to make the other stumble. You wonder if the minstrel's little song is his way of doing exactly that. Still, you know better than to bide openly. You bide your time. A few nights later, when the minstrel plays during a feast, you wander behind him and mimic his posture, his strumming, his intense artist gaze. You don't say a word, just shadow him so closely that when he finally turns to glare, the audience bursts into laughter. The king claps. You bow, bells chiming. The rivalry doesn't vanish, but the balance shifts. You've reminded the room that while anyone can play a song, only a fool can turn it into a weapon without drawing blood. It isn't all bruises, sharp tongues, and political tightropes. Every so often, you find yourself in a moment so light, so simple, that you almost forget the stakes. It might be fleeting, gone in the space between two bell chimes, but it's enough to remind you why you first picked up a jesting stick in the market square years ago. One of those moments comes on a rainy afternoon. The court is restless, trapped indoors by a sky that's been weeping since dawn. The air in the great hall feels heavy, the fire crackles without much warmth, and even the hounds are too bored to beg. The king slouches in his chair, toying with a goblet, his advisors mumbling half-heartedly about the spring tax collection. You, wandering in with your bells muted under a cloak, spot a page sitting cross-legged by the hearth, staring into the flames like they might swallow him whole. Without thinking, you pull a couple of apples from the kitchen, toss one his way, and start juggling the other two. His eyes light up, and he scrambles to his feet to try and copy you. His first throw sends the apple bouncing across the flagstones toward the dais. You scoop it up in an exaggerated chase, scolding the apple for trying to join the nobles, and the boy dissolves into giggles. The king notices, leans forward, and calls you closer. "What's the crime?" he asks, gesturing to the apple in your hand. You drop into a mock bow. "Attempted treason, your majesty. The prisoner tried to take the throne." It's not the wittiest line you've ever delivered, but it gets a genuine chuckle from the king, deep, unguarded. A few of the nearby nobles laugh too, the kind of laugh that doesn't carry any hidden blades. Even the hawk-nosed duke smiles, though it's thin as ever. Historians still argue whether these lighter moments between ruler and fool were calculated acts of courtly performance, or real human connection. You're living proof they can be both. A harmless laugh can grease the gears of diplomacy as easily as an elaborate jest can jab at them. Later that week, during a feast, a kitchen maid drops a jug of watered wine. It shatters loudly, spilling across the floor. Normally, the steward would scowl, the maid would flush crimson, and the whole moment would vanish into tense silence. But you leap up, declare the puddler, newly discovered inland sea, and dive to the floor, pretending to fish from it with a table knife. The maid laughs so hard she forgets to be afraid, and the steward lets the accident slide. That's the strange thing about joy in your job, it's rarely grand. It's a child's laughter, a weary king's sudden smile, a servant's relief. It's catching the queen's expression soften when you slip a single flower into her goblet instead of a joke, or hearing the minstrels try not to laugh when you parody their most pompous song. Quirky tidbit: some fools, especially in smaller courts, were beloved not just for their wit but for their role as mood keepers. Chroniclers tell of jesters who comforted grieving kings or distracted lords during illness, small mercies that no one else dared attempt. In those moments, the motley isn't a disguise, it's a key. That rainy afternoon with the page turns into a quiet memory you carry with you. Because even though you spend most days guarding your tongue like a sword edge, some nights you get to sheath it entirely. You get to be, just for a breath, what the paintings and poems pretend you are all the time, a bringer of laughter for laughter's sake. And in a place where every word might be weighed for its political worth, that kind of laughter feels like gold no duke can hoard. The first sign that something is wrong comes not with shouting, but with the absence of it. The great hall, normally a cauldron of clinking goblets, bursts of laughter, and the occasional bark from a hound, feels hushed, the air heavy enough to press on your chest. The king sits at the high table, his goblet untouched, his eyes shadowed. Nobles murmur in corners instead of striding through the center of the room. Even the minstrel's strings sound muted, as though they've been warned not to play too brightly. You don't know the details yet, but word travels in currents too subtle for most to notice. A servant passes you in the corridor, eyes downcast. A lady-in-waiting clutches her rosary so tightly her knuckles blanch. By the time you reach your place near the dais, you've pieced together a vague picture. Someone important has died. The official announcement comes mid-afternoon. The herald's voice wavers only slightly as he declares that a favored cousin of the king has passed, suddenly, during a journey between estates. No one dares to speak of cause, though you hear whispers later about fever, or poison, or a fall from a horse. Historians still argue whether court fools were expected to avoid sorrow entirely or to carefully thread it into their performances. Either way, you know one thing for certain: the wrong tone now could sink you faster than any scandal. When you're called to perform that evening, the high table is somber. You can feel every eye on you, not in expectation of mirth, but in wariness. Will you misstep? Will you turn grief into mockery even by accident? You keep your movements smaller, your voice gentler. Instead of a riotous tale, you offer a quiet, meandering fable about a bird who loses her flock and learns to navigate by the moon. It's not a laugh-out-loud story, but it earns faint smiles, and the queen's eyes soften for a moment. Quirky tidbit: in some medieval courts, fools were the only ones allowed to make subtle commentary on tragedy, masking it in metaphor. A jester might speak of a wilted rose in the royal garden, or a missing star in the king's sky, both acknowledging the loss and offering a frame for grief. You lean on that tradition now, weaving phrases like, "The hall feels one candle dimmer," into your lines. The mood doesn't lighten, but it shifts, just enough for people to breathe without feeling they're breaking a rule. Later, in the quiet of your alcove, you think about how strange it is to be both shield and mirror. Your job is to protect the court from silence that's too deep, but also to reflect its mood honestly enough that no one feels you're pretending all is well. The next day, the tension in the air has turned brittle. The hawk-nosed duke moves like a man stepping through glass, careful and deliberate. The king speaks little. In the midst of this, you overhear two knights discussing who will inherit the cousin's estates. The conversation is clipped cautious, but it tells you that grief at court is never only grief, it's also rearrangement. That evening you're summoned again. This time, the king doesn't ask for a story. He just wants you to sit by the fire while he stares into the flames. Eventually, he says, almost to himself, "Do you know what it is to lose someone who laughed with you before the crown was yours?" You shake your head. "No," you admit softly. "But I know what it's like to wish I could make them laugh again." He doesn't answer, but his shoulders drop slightly. In a court where every pause is political, that small moment feels more valuable than applause. You start to notice it in the small silences first. The polite, distracted nods when you crack a line that used to get a roar. The way the king's eyes slide past you toward the new fire eater from Florence, or the contortionist who can fold herself into a wooden chest like she's part cat. You've been the dependable fool for years, and suddenly the court has developed a taste for novelties, each more exotic, more dangerous, more glitter-coated than the last. At feasts, your slot in the evening's amusements creeps later and later, until you're wedged between the dessert course and the point where half the hall slips away to gossip in the corridors. Even the servants you used to banter with in the buttery seem preoccupied, carrying instructions for other performers' props and costumes. You can't help but wonder, are they quietly reassigning you to some ceremonial post? A royal menagerie always needs someone to shovel after the peacocks. The truth is, medieval courts thrived on spectacle, and fashions and entertainment could shift faster than a courtier's loyalty. One decade, witty wordplay is the height of refinement; the next, everyone's obsessed with trained bears. Historians still argue whether most jesters retired with a pension or were simply shown the gate once the applause died, but records show plenty ended their days as gatekeepers, messengers, or, in one particularly grim case, an assistant to the royal falconer. The falcons, by the way, were better fed. You keep performing, because what else can you do? Juggle, tumble, spin stories, and pray for a laugh, though now you rehearse escape plans in the quiet hours. Maybe a wealthy merchant's household would hire you, or a traveling troupe. Or maybe you'll just vanish one evening, slipping out through the postern gate with nothing but your bells and a loaf of bread. That uncertainty hums in your ears louder than any applause, a reminder that even the king's fool is just one more replaceable voice in the endless, restless carnival of court life. And now, as the motley fades into the shadows of memory, you can let yourself drift too. You've walked the echoing halls, felt the sting of laughter that cuts and the warmth of laughter that heals, and you've carried the weight of bells that once rang so brightly. Those bells are quieter now, their jingle softened into something almost like a lullaby. The court itself grows dim in your mind's eye, candles guttering low, rushes scattered across the flagstones, nobles slipping away one by one until only the hush of the chamber remains. The air is cool, but no longer sharp with expectation. Instead, it feels like the soft touch of night air through a half-open window, a reminder that the world carries on beyond the walls of pageantry and politics. You've seen how quickly favor shifts, how novelty steals the spotlight, and how even kings grow tired of familiar faces. And yet here, in this quiet moment, none of that matters. The stage is empty, the feasting table cleared, the murmurs of gossip gone. What remains is you, no longer forced to leap or jest, simply breathing steadily in the dark. Let the sounds of the court fall away. Let the torches dim until they are only tiny glimmers in the distance. Picture the heavy curtains drawn, muffling the last echoes of music, until you are wrapped in silence as soft as wool. Historians may still argue whether fools found happy retirements or lonely endings, but for tonight you don't have to decide. You can choose the softer path, where the bells rest, the motley is folded away, and the weight of expectation finally slips from your shoulders. Close your eyes. Let the hush of history carry you. Sleep comes easily now. Sweet dreams.